In this task, we are asked to develop a function, and that function is going to involve rolling some dice, which will also involve random number generation. Since this is the Java language, we will use arrays for handling the set of 3 dice rolls. So what we'll do is we will start off by setting up the function. I'm going to put in the words private and static. You can turn a blind eye to those at GCSE level and start engaging here, where we have to specify that this function is going to be returning an array of 3 integers. We don't need the number 3 as part of stating the data type that will be returned. I'm going to call this function get 3 dice rolls. Could say die rolls, couldn't I? 3 die rolls. And that's the function set up, ready to go. The next thing we have to give due regard to then is the use of random number generation. We begin by setting up a variable whose data type is random, and we just use equals new random to build a new variable. Now, NetBeans is flagging this in red. Java is denying all knowledge of this data type, and the reason for that is that it has to be imported. So again, I'm going to use the IDE to help me to do some of the work for me, and just simply by clicking there, it will type in the import statement that I require in the correct position in the code. Next, we go to think about how do we use this variable? What good is it? So this variable has built-in methods, so we use the dot to access the built-in methods, and the method that I'm interested in is nextInt. But as you can see, there are 2 variants of nextInt. This variant of nextInt will return a single integer, and so will this one, but this second one takes in a parameter. So if we look at the second one, we'll see that the Java documentation is provided for us. It's being slow to load. Just see if we can click on it again. There we go. So it returns a pseudo-random uniformly distributed int value between 0, inclusive of the value 0, and the specified value exclusive of that value. So the ramifications here are that if we were to say that the value we're going to specify is the number 6, that means that this function call is going to return values which are either 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5, but not the number 6. So, because it excludes the number 6. Now, if the values returned are in the range 0 to 5 inclusive, that means that if I add 1 to that value, that it will now shift everything along, and now I'll have a random number in the range 1 to 6 inclusive, which does reflect the reality of rolling a standard die. So I will need to store the result inside a variable, so I'm going to store it in a variable called die roll. The next step in progressing to a solution is to figure out how are we going to get it to do this 3 times and then return the result that is desired, which is an array of 3 numbers. So just after building the random number generator variable, I'm also going to build an array of 3 integers, and I'll just call it dice, and I'll say it's a new integer array with 3 values in it. By default, that will mean that it'll come up with just 3 zeros in it, none of which are valid numbers. What we'll then do is we will declare the die roll variable separately, and then we will initialize it inside the for loop. So we know that we're going to be doing this 3 times, so we're going to create an integer I is equal to 0, I has to be less than 3, I plus plus. So what we do is we take our code from earlier and we say that die roll becomes equal to a randomly generated number. Then what we're going to have to do is put die roll into our array. So the array is called dice. The value of I will allow us to keep track of where we are at inside the array. So we go to the array element at position I and we set it to be the die roll that has just been generated. Now that we've got the for loop built, that means that 3 times it's going to generate a random number and store it in this variable, and then put the value from the variable into the array. When we take a step back and look at our solution, we see that the integer variable called die_roll is actually not needed. What we can do is we can just generate the random number immediately at the point of use, eliminating the need for the die_roll variable at all. Finally, since this thing is a function, it's called get3die_rolls. It doesn't take any parameters, but because it's a function, it has to return an array of integers. That means that we have to return dice, which is an array of 3 random numbers in the range 1 to 6 inclusive. In order to test that this has worked, we need to call our function. We are going to build an integer array called dice rolled, and we're going to call the function in order to generate those 3. Then we're going to build a simple for loop that will print the value each time, just like that. Okay, so the for loop there, I used FORI tab in order to let NetBeans set up the for loop for me. And so it understood that it's going to be iterating through all of the characters, the elements of the dice rolled array. And so this should work now if we test it. So let's do save, and I'm going to use Shift and F6 to run my program. And so it says that the dice rolls are 2, 3, and 3. Let's run it again. Shift and F6, and it's 1, 6, and 1. Let's go again, Shift and F6, 1, 4, 6, and once more, Shift and F6. So testing in this case is somewhat more challenging because no matter how many times you run this, you're not really guaranteed to see unusual behaviours such as the output of a 0 or the output of a 6, one of the kind of boundary erroneous cases. You may never see it even though you may have that bug in your program. So it can be very difficult to test this. Bearing in mind that the purpose of testing is to make sure that the system has met the original requirements, we can ask ourselves, does this meet the original requirements? And I feel like yes, it does. So we can comment our function to say, be able to generate random numbers, and then store the 3 die rolls. And then here, repeat the die roll 3 times, adding it to the array. And finally, return the 3 die rolls. And we could put in a comment at the top of this function. Let's put in a javadoc comment using 2 stars. And we will say that this rolls 3 fair dice. And the return value is an array of 3 die rolls, 1 to 6 inclusive, like that. Okay, and that completes the function with good commenting, good indentation, and then we've also tested it to make sure that it works.